Colossians 2:16-17 stands as one of the most debated passages in the Pauline epistles. Paul writes, "Therefore let no one judge you in food or in drink, or regarding a festival or a new moon or Sabbaths." A common modern reading of this verse assumes it acts as a universal cancellation of the Old Testament moral law, including the weekly Sabbath. The historical and grammatical evidence suggests a different conclusion. The text focuses on specific ceremonial applications rather than the permanent status of God's commands. Paul addresses a localized syncretic heresy. His argument targets specific external regulations added by false teachers rather than the moral will established in the Decalogue. Misidentifying the target of Paul's critique creates a theological contradiction. It risks removing the foundation of moral reality and replacing it with a framework that permits lawlessness. This photograph shows ruins in the region surrounding Colossae. Between 60 and 62 AD, this was a small city in Asia Minor, already in decline. Epaphras, a worker who learned the gospel under Paul's ministry, carried the message back to his hometown to found this church. While Paul was imprisoned in Rome, Epaphras arrived with news of a specific threat to the congregation. The Colossian believers were supplementing Jesus with outside religious practices. They were integrating local philosophical ideas to ensure their spiritual safety. Adding external rituals to Christ's sacrifice implies that the sacrifice is inadequate on its own. This supplementation logic shifts the focus away from the sufficiency of the cross. This dynamic forms the central tension of the letter. Paul's response centers on whether Christ alone provides sufficient salvation and spiritual authority. The church faced syncretism, which is the blending of distinct religious and philosophical systems into a single compromised theology. This philosophy demanded specific dietary restrictions, mandatory festival observances, and a form of humility expressed through the veneration of angels. These practices were intended to manage the Stoikia. This Greek term refers to the elemental spiritual forces or governing principles that the culture believed controlled the physical world. False teachers promised protection from these forces through strict rule-keeping, summarized by Paul as "do not touch, do not taste, do not handle." This system taught that spiritual growth and safety are achievements tied to human effort and the regulation of external behaviors. Fearing elemental forces traps the believer in a cycle of constant appeasement, trading the assurance of the gospel for spiritual anxiety. Paul responds by ignoring the individual rules of the false teachers. He focuses his entire argument on the nature of Christ. In chapter 1, Paul identifies Christ as the active creator of all things, visible and invisible. This includes the thrones, dominions, and the very Stoikia the Colossians feared. As their creator, Christ holds authority over these powers. They remain subservient to his design. Paul describes the cross as a legal victory. Christ wiped out the record of debt that stood against humanity and publicly disarmed the principalities and powers. Because of this victory, Paul tells the Colossians they are complete in him. They possess the fullness of God and require no additional spiritual rituals or mediators. Recognizing Christ as the architect of the universe and the victor over its powers removes the logical basis for appeasing lesser spiritual authorities. Colossians 2:16 addresses a specific list: festival, new moon, or Sabbaths. This sequence matches an Old Testament formula, referencing the yearly, monthly, and weekly cycles of the ceremonial worship system. Paul describes these practices as a shadow. In biblical typology, a shadow is a temporary projection that points toward an approaching substance. The yearly festivals and ceremonial feast days reached their intended completion in Christ's redemptive work. The false teachers were weaponizing these completed shadows to judge the believer's spiritual standing. Relying on a fulfilled shadow is a theological step backward. It acts as a denial of the arrival of the actual substance. There is a distinction between the fulfilled ceremonial Sabbaths Paul addresses and the permanent moral law of God. This photograph shows the peaks of Mount Sinai. This is the historical origin for the ceremonial law, where the Levitical system and its specific feast days were given to Israel. The weekly Sabbath originates at the Genesis creation week, appearing much earlier than the ceremonial laws established at Sinai. It predates the Levitical system by thousands of years, functioning as a foundational moral reality for all humanity rather than a typological shadow. Colossians 2 targets the imposition of ceremonial metrics. The moral law of God remains in effect. Confounding these two distinct legal frameworks leads to severe interpretive errors regarding God's enduring will. In chapter 3, Paul shifts to practical application. Freedom from ceremonial shadows does not grant permission for lawlessness. Paul commands the Colossians to seek those things which are above. The spiritual focus of the believer moves away from external regulations toward Christ. Christian transformation results from a deepening union with Christ. It is a product of internal change, rather than a result of conforming to human regulations. Paul compares the freedom of being rooted in Christ against the exhausting nature of the do not touch philosophy. Spiritual freedom is found through submission to Christ. Relying on external compliance to obsolete rituals provides only an appearance of wisdom. Colossians warns against any system that uses religious observance to supplement the finished work of Christ. Believers are no longer subject to judgment regarding fulfilled ceremonial practices. The record of debt has been removed, and the powers have been defeated. Examine your own framework for any modern additions or personal rules you might be using to earn a sense of spiritual completeness. The status of the believer is defined by the cross. You are complete and lacking nothing. Because Christ is supreme and his work is sufficient, adding to the gospel acts as a subtraction. In Christ, you are complete.